welcome back to Nails Before Films. Since Deadpool and Wolverine is coming out within 2 weeks, I suddenly remembered that I had never watched the X-Men movies except for Logan and the 2 Deadpool movies. So I decided to watch and review most of them before seeing Deadpool and Wolverine. I won't be watching Apocalypse and Dark Phoenix because neither Wolverine nor Deadpool has anything to do with those films, and I've heard that they're pretty terrible. Anyway, for this video, I'll be going over the original trilogy, which includes X-Men, X2, and X-Men The Last Stand. Overall, I think the OG trilogy is very solid. Granted, The Last Stand is weaker than its predecessors, but as a whole, the first 3 X-Men movies do successfully translate the world of mutants to the big screen. That being said, I'm not terribly familiar with X-Men comics, so my opinion is that of someone who only knows the basics of X-Men. Let's start with the first movie, which also happens to be my favorite so far, X-Men. X-Men does a great job of introducing the characters and a world where mutants with special powers exist. The movie is only an hour and 44 minutes, but it manages to tell an engaging story with interesting characters efficiently. My favorite characters from the movie are actually Professor X and Magneto. Their conflict is just so interesting. Both of them care deeply about mutants and wish to change the way they're treated. However, their methods are polar opposites. Professor X believes there is a peaceful way to coexist with humans, while Magneto has no sympathy towards them and believes mutants to be superior. However, you understand where Magneto is coming from because of his past. He went through World War II when he was separated from his parents, so it's reasonable that he has no faith in humanity and believes humans would do the same thing to mutants as the Nazis did to Jews. The film conveys this through an efficient opening scene as well as Magneto's actions. His motivation is clear and understandable, making the audience sympathetic towards him. It definitely helps that they're played by Patrick Stewart and Ian McKellen, who are both great actors who understood the assignment. Besides the mutants, the humans are also intriguing. While humans are sort of the villains in the story, they're not definitively bad either. The concerns Senator Kelly mentions in the hearing are reasonable, but that doesn't mean a registration act is the solution. Despite the senator starting out as a villain who's nothing but hostile toward mutants, we feel somewhat bad when he dies because it seems he grows sympathetic towards mutants after becoming one of them. I think the conversation he has with Storm is particularly interesting. It shows that both mutants and humans are afraid of each other. So no matter who you are, we're always afraid of things or people different from ourselves. That's why communication and empathy are so important. The story of X-Men is somewhat thought-provoking because no one is decidedly bad. Everyone is just doing what they believe to be best. Of course, assuming mutants are dangerous and forcing them to expose themselves is bad. So is forcing humans to quote-unquote evolve and killing them in the process. Which is why the X-Men are decidedly the good guys. But I think the movie does a good job of portraying each side's perspective. And as a result, we can understand and relate to their point of view. The other characters are good enough as well. We don't really get to know much about Jean, Scott, and Storm, but they're quite likable and the movie uses them in meaningful ways. None of them feels excessive and they all contribute in their own ways. As for Rogue, she's okay. You do feel bad for her because almost killing your boyfriend must be pretty traumatic, and it's sad not being able to have direct physical contact with anyone. However, I just think it's weird that Professor X and the X-Men don't think of the possibility that Magneto wants Rogue instead of Wolverine. That twist is so painfully obvious, and I find it hard to believe someone as smart as the professor doesn't think of it. The last thing I'm going to mention about X-Men is, of course, Wolverine. Hugh Jackman is just so amazing as Logan. From the looks to his acting, he's just so perfect. While he's not the most important character in the story, he's definitely the most memorable. We don't know that much about his background, but enough to understand why he's tough, cynical, and maybe a bit selfish. However, he's a good person inside and would risk his own life to help others, which is what makes a hero. And Hugh Jackman portrays that so perfectly. The only thing I don't like about Logan's character in this movie is how suddenly he falls for Jean. There's no interaction between the two characters that would result in romantic interest. Heck, Logan almost kills Jean when they first meet. So it's weird to me how Logan suddenly flirts with her, and even weirder how Jean flirts back. Besides that, I really like Wolverine, and I'm happy that Hugh Jackman came back to do a Deadpool movie with Ryan Reynolds. That's about it for X-Men. Next, X2, which I also think is an interesting superhero movie. Instead of mutants against mutants like what they did in X-Men, X2's main villain is a human, Colonel Stryker, who wishes to wipe out all of the mutants using Professor X's power. This forces the X-Men to join forces with Magneto to save all mutants. I like how they don't just rehash the first movie, and we get to see how humans would eliminate mutants instead of the other way around. While Stryker isn't as charismatic as Magneto, he's still a compelling villain in my opinion. You understand why he hates mutants so much, but maybe because they go over his motive only in a few lines, it's not as effective as Magneto's backstory in X-Men. And compared to the first movie, where there doesn't seem to be a definitive bad guy, Stryker is very obviously the villain because of how cruel he is. Even with his tragic past, it's hard to justify his actions. That being said, I still think the conflict in X2 is intriguing, especially how Magneto does a reverse Uno and tries to kill all humans with Charles's power. It really shows that humans and mutants aren't so different after all. They're all capable of terrible, inhumane things. However, I have a small complaint regarding that part. When Magneto opens Cerebro by force, doesn't he risk killing all of the mutants? According to Jean, forcefully opening Cerebro could sever the link and kill everyone who's connected to the professor. Doesn't Magneto know this risk? Doesn't he care about the lives of all mutants? An explanation would be that because Magneto helped build Cerebro, he knew how to open it without severing the link. However, the movie doesn't explain this, and it seems like Magneto just opens it by force, which is a small plot hole in my opinion. Another thing I'm sure a lot of people don't understand is why Jean must leave the plane to help the X-Men escape. Why can't she do it on the plane? Won't her power work that way as well? Look, I do like Jean's sacrifice, it's really touching, but it could have been explained better. Maybe the power of the flood is too strong. Jean has to be outside to stop the water from flooding the jet. A simple explanation like that would help the audience understand why her sacrifice is necessary. Instead, they just vaguely say that she made her choice. I'm also not happy with how Professor X responds to Jean's sacrifice. I expect him to be more torn by her decision. Maybe have Logan or Scott tell the professor to control Jean and get her back, and have him reply in pain that he can't and this is the only way. While not as prominent as Jean's death, I'm not very happy with how they handle Jason's death either. I know it's impossible to save him, especially when he's hardly living anymore, but I expect some sort of closure for him from the professor. Instead, he dies thinking he disappointed his father. It's really sad, and I thought the professor would at least try to help him before he inevitably dies. I also don't like how Scott is so sidelined in this movie. Both Jean and Storm get more screen time and development in X2, but not Scott. He disappears for most of the movie after being captured by Stryker. So after 2 films, all we know about Scott is that he's kind of a Boy Scout and he loves Jean. I feel like there must be more they can do with his character. Maybe have him fight against the brainwashing during his fight with Jean. Just give us something more, anything. My last complaint is minor, but I just think Bobby's conversation with his family seems forced. He doesn't have to tell his parents that he's a mutant. He can just say that something happened at school and they're forced to take a break or something. I know it's a weak explanation, but it's also weird how he just suddenly comes clean about being a mutant and doesn't even try to talk his way out of it. And I really don't understand why Bobby's brother is so upset. There's no indication or implication that he hates mutants, so I was really confused when he went as far as calling the police on his brother. Anyway, despite my complaints, I still think X2 is a solid superhero movie. The characters that were great in the last film, like Logan, Professor X, and Magneto, are still amazing in this one. I also like Nightcrawler a lot. He represents how one can still be empathetic and faithful despite how poorly the world treats him. Overall, X2 explores the human-mutant conflict entertainingly, which makes it a successful X-Men film in my opinion. Lastly, X-Men The Last Stand, the weakest of the first three. I feel like the premise of the film is interesting, it's just not done very well. This time, instead of trying to kill the mutants, humans come up with a quote-unquote cure to turn mutants into humans. Naturally, some mutants find this cure to be offensive because it implies that there's something wrong with them that needs to be fixed. However, for some of the mutants, like Rogue, it's a chance for them to have a normal life. The situation is further complicated when the military uses this cure as a weapon against mutants. Of course, Magneto and his faction believe the cure is the first step in eradicating mutants, and a conflict between humans and mutants becomes inevitable. I do like how the movie doesn't portray the cure as a purely bad thing and presents both perspectives. We understand why some mutants resent the idea of a cure because it denies their existence. However, it's also reasonable why people like Rogue would want the cure. In Rogue's case, not being able to have physical contact with the ones you love is no way to live, so you can't blame her for wanting to be normal. But I don't really understand why Angel doesn't want the cure. He says that the cure is what his dad wants, it's not what he wants. But you freaking tried to cut off your wings when you were a kid, so of course your dad is going to think you don't want them. Anyway, my main problem is how the movie ends. How come after all that happens, humans and mutants can suddenly coexist peacefully? After what Magneto did to the bridge and how Phoenix kills a bunch of people, shouldn't humans be more wary of mutants and call for stricter laws? I also think it's weird how humans just give up on the idea of a mutant cure. Isn't the cure more important than ever now that they've seen what mutants can do? When the movie ended, I was like, what? Why are you all acting like everything is fine now? Nothing is solved. The Last Stand just feels much more incomplete than its predecessor, and maybe that's because it tries to do too much. Besides the mutant cure storyline, there's also the Dark Phoenix story regarding Jean Grey, and it's really underdeveloped. Jean being so powerful to the point that she can't control her power is interesting, and so is how Professor X helps her by setting up psychic barriers to keep her powers in check. However, I don't really understand what the film is trying to say regarding Charles's way of dealing with Jean. On one hand, Wolverine is dismissive of his method, believing that it's wrong to tamper with Jean's mind, and his manipulation may have been what led to the rampage of Phoenix once she's set free. But on the other, it would seem that Charles is right. Jean's way too powerful and must be kept in check. Is there really no other way for Jean to control her power? It seems weird for someone as powerful as Charles to use such drastic measures and ignore Jean's will. It doesn't help that Jean doesn't really do anything after killing Professor X. She just sort of follows Magneto around, and I don't understand why. Isn't Phoenix supposed to be pure instinct? Then shouldn't she go off on her own and do whatever she wants? Why does she go with Magneto? Jean's actions are really bizarre in The Last Stand, and her plotline doesn't really align with the mutant cure plotline either. It's like you're watching two unrelated things simultaneously, which makes me question why Dark Phoenix needs to be shoved into this movie. Seriously, nothing Jean does directly affect the other storyline, so why forcefully put these two together? In X2, at least Wolverine finding out his past is related to their mission of stopping Stryker, but Jean's story has nothing to do with the cure. I thought maybe the X-Men would try to use the cure or the boy's power to stop Jean, but no, Wolverine had to kill her himself. Logan being the only one able to kill Jean due to his healing factor is cool, and so is the scene of him disintegrating to the bones and healing afterward. But the impact of that is diminished when you think of the possibility of saving Jean using the cure. This is not a hard issue to fix, just show that the cure will disintegrate before it reaches Jean or something. But overall, Dark Phoenix just doesn't mix with the mutant cure storyline. Another thing that bugs me is how Wolverine loves Jean. As I mentioned before, I don't understand why Logan falls for Jean so quickly, despite knowing nothing about her. over the 3 movies, there's nothing between the two that convinces me that Logan loves her. It's still sad that Logan has to kill Jean, but the emotional payoff is significantly diminished for me because I just don't find their relationship to be believable. I also think Scott's death is super underwhelming, and he's the only major X-Men who doesn't get enough screen time or development over 3 movies. I was so disappointed when he died kissing Jean and accomplished nothing in this movie. Due to the anticlimactic ending of everything being fine despite nothing being solved and the forcefully mashed storylines, The Last Stand is a pretty weak end to an otherwise solid trilogy. Anyway, that's basically my thoughts on the first 3 X-Men movies. They're definitely a lot better than I expected, especially considering that the first one came out over 20 years ago. While some of the characters are a bit disappointing, like Colossus and Juggernaut, the visual effect is pretty good for its time. The suits are also generic compared to the variety and brightness of the comic, but considering what they can do during that time, I don't think a yellow spandex will look good on Hugh Jackman. Some of the special effects are really cool, besides the scene of Wolverine disintegrating and regenerating in The Last Stand, as I mentioned before. Scenes like Senator Kelly bursting into a puddle of water in X-Men and Nightcrawler teleporting in X2 are all amazing. With intriguing stories, compelling characters, and great visuals, I would say the X-Men movies are a solid start to modern superhero movies. Hope you guys like my review and nails. I just did Wolverine, Professor X, Jean, Storm, and Scott for this one. They're not that good, but at least recognizable, or so I hope. Let me know what you think in the comments. I'll be watching the rest of the movies following the order when they came out, but the next video will probably be about the Wolverine trilogy, which includes X-Men Origin Wolverine, The Wolverine, and Logan. As always, like, subscribe, hit that notification bell, comment, share, do what you want, keep nailing it, and drink beer if you're an adult, bub.